I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1971 class of films, a very interesting year as we transition into sort of the 70s tour-driven Hollywood and away from sort of the old studio system Hollywood. And I think this is a seminal film in seeing how the Academy can be very looking ahead and very relevant and very modern, but also very much a thing of the past. I'm talking about 1971's Nicholas and Alexandra. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture, and I talk about why I think that has sort of been forgotten. I pick one that has been recommended to me or one I haven't heard about at all, and I talk about sort of the Oscar history, why it was nominated. It's so crucial to understand the Oscar history, to understand the time and the time Hollywood it was at. But then I also look at my thoughts on the film, and I give sort of a central idea as to why it hasn't held up through sort of the explanation of the history and some of my thoughts. And this year, it's a really interesting year. We're at 1971, we started at 1988, we're working backwards. So let me know in the comments down below what you'd like me to see for 1970. But for sure, with the 5 nominees this year, we started off with The French Connection, which was the eventual Best Picture winner, and sort of seen as the clear Best Picture winner because it was one a bunch of the precursors. This was sort of seen as a new talent with William Friedkin, who of course did this in 1971, and then in 1973 did The Exorcist, sort of a great back 1-2 sort of punch there. And definition, sort of a great gritty crime drama. 70s New York is one of my all-time favorite settings, so I really enjoy this movie. But it was sort of seen as, and William Friedkin I think was only 32 at the time, he was sort of seen as a new talent ushering in this new decade, similarly to someone like Peter Bogdanovich, who was also nominated for The Last Picture Show, another sort of younger director who had been a film critic and now became a film director, who has now has made a second movie and got nominated for Best Picture. It was sort of seen because at this time, it was sort of seen as in the 60s, it was very studio driven, but now with the advent of the smaller camera and sort of taste changing, we see much more of the youth and sort of realistic younger people taking over the camera and trying to tell stories. This is sort of the class of those guys, and then sort of the blockbuster guys with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, but then we also have Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and Brian De Palma, and sort of this sort of whole class of young filmmakers who ushered in this new decade. And so I didn't choose French Connection because I've seen it before. I really enjoyed it. Won Best Picture. I think it's been well remembered. Last Picture Show, Peter Bogdanovich, he had 71 with Last Picture Show. Then he had 72, What's Up Doc. 73 was Paper Moon, which are all sort of awards contention, so I'd heard about this movie. Another one was A Clockwork Orange, which is arguably maybe my favorite Stanley Kubrick movie. It's so hard to pick, but that's one of my favorites for sure. I'd actually talk about it on my Masters of Controlled Chaos episode for Stanley Kubrick, so check that one out. So obviously didn't choose that one, I already talked about it. So then there's 2 options. There was Fiddler on the Roof and Nicholas and Alexandra. Fiddler on the Roof was an interesting one because, you know, even within musical nerds, I don't think it's that well known as the movie. You know, of course, the play is very well known, it's a very successful play, but the movie less so. So I think, but there was also from director Norman Jewison, who I've been sort of dodging throughout these episodes because he's been so prevalent. I think he has like 7 nominations throughout a bunch of decades, and decades that we've been talking about him, but I've sort of always been dodging him because I want to talk about him for his first movie as a way to sort of talk about his entire career. So I haven't talked about him yet. So my option was Nicholas and Alexandra, and a very fascinating time in regards to the history, because it really only, at the year, only had a couple precursors, with the Golden Globes having a couple promising newcomers, and I think a cinematography or a costume design, sort of a technical award. So it surprised people when it got nominated for Best Picture, because it got Best Lead Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Lead Actress, Best Supporting Actor, John Baker, Glenda Jackson, respectively, and then had a bunch of technical awards, and then also happened to get Best Picture. However, it is notable it didn't get Best Director, and now that's actually a theme that's been going on for Forgotten Oscar Films, if you haven't been noticing. This is now, it marks the 7th movie in a row where the film that I chose for Forgotten Oscar Film was not nominated for Best Director. So it's very interesting to see. Almost the Academy at the time knew that, you know, this wasn't maybe a super seminal film. It was a great vehicle for maybe acting. It had some good writing. It had some good technical awards. And then, oh heck, we'll just give it a Best Picture nomination too. It's never going to win, but it's going to get the nomination at least. So they almost knew at the time that these wouldn't be super relevant. But maybe that's sort of my taste. I've done a series on Masters of Social Chaos where I've looked at directors, and that's how my relationship works. I look at a director that I like, and then I check out all his films. But if there's a movie that doesn't have a strong director, or a director I've never heard of, or hasn't made a lot of other movies, I just won't go back to his films. And I think maybe that's the reason why some of them are forgotten, not to jump ahead. But also, I think that, there's another film like Sunday Bloody Sunday, which got Best Lead Actor, Best Lead Actress, Best Writing, and Best Director, but didn't get nominated for Best Picture. Well, that film's sort of been less remembered as well, I would say. I haven't heard of that movie either, so I could have gone with that one. So maybe it was a little double-edged sword. This was a film that definitely actually felt like an important film at the time because of its past history, because this is sort of the last of the epic era. So if you don't know, I would define the epic era, you would say, between 55 and 71 here, where there was these big movies every few years that cost a lot of money, that were 3+ hours long, and were expected to get either awards contention and make a lot of money. They really were huge gambles in a lot of sense. There was big architects behind them, guys like David Lean and Sam Spiegel, the producer of this movie, for example. And there's, think of 10 Commandments, think of Dr. Zhivago, think of Lawrence of Arabia. These long movies with intermissions that cost a lot, that were sort of these historical epics a lot of times, or religious epics that made a large amount of money. And really, a little bit of history lesson, in the early 40s, with the advent in the early 40s, about half the American population went to the movies every single week. It was a huge deal. But then with the advent of television in the 50s and 60s and the popularization of it, going to the American household, we started to see less and less people go to the movies. So they tried gimmicks, something like smell-o-vision, 3D. But what they sort of realized was the biggest success was treating them like big events. Lawrence of Arabia is a 3-hour plus movie, and it has an intermission in it, and it made so much money and became this huge thing. It was projected on 70mm film, where the traditional was 35mm, so it became a much bigger screen, and the quality and the visual density was much higher. So you can have a giant screen, and you have this sort of small little black dot. If you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, you know what I'm talking about, of the mirage that you can only see in a giant screen. So, this was sort of emblematic of that, because it had a huge Oscar campaign. It was released at the end of the year, so people felt like, oh, this is going to be an important film, but then ultimately it wasn't. It felt a little bit too long. It felt a movie of the past. It didn't feel like a 70s movie. I look at this and it feels like Lawrence of Arabia. It doesn't feel like The French Connection, for example. So it felt like a movie that felt important at the time because, oh, look at Lawrence of Arabia, look at all these other films that, Dr. Zhivago, for example, the 8th highest grossing movie of all time. 10 Commandments is the 6th highest grossing movie of all time, more than The Exorcist, more than Avengers Endgame, more than Avatar. I mean, these are massive, massive movies. So you have to keep that in context, that this movie felt important at the time, but ultimately it was a sort of failure because it wasn't super well critically regarded. It sort of felt like it was given those Oscar nominations, and it didn't make a lot of money financially. And this was for Sam Spiegel, his last big epic film, and David Lean's last big epic film, Ryan's Daughter, wasn't successful either, which cost a lot of money. It was a huge failure, so it was sort of a big gamble, and it only took one of these big gambles to fail for them to stop. And as we sort of transitioned, like I said, the earlier sort of youth-driven 70s style of movie making. Transitioning into my thoughts, I think this is actually a really interesting movie because I think it's a fascinating time in history. I also really enjoy the central character. If you don't know, the movie is about Tsar Nicholas II, who is you would say the king of Russia, I guess, and his wife Alexandra, and sort of their dynamic. And if you don't know, he was the last king of Russia because there was a Russian Revolution that sort of overthrew him. And we see his rise and fall. And certainly with something like Lawrence of Arabia, or even Ben-Hur to a certain extent, like there is sort of a rise and a fall, and sort of this epic long journey throughout multiple wars and multiple decades, and the history of the whole family. And I think that's when it excels, when it focuses on Nicholas and Alexandra and their sort of dynamic, and Rasputin that has come in, and sort of the interesting character of Nicholas that wants to respect his history, but also not give in, but also listen to his advisors. Like, there's a great internal conflict. But unfortunately, sometimes the dialogue feels stilted and forced. and very sort of awkward because it feels like it has an exposition machine just to explain everything. A lot of times it works when it's worrying about Nicholas and sort of his internal conflict, his relationship with Alexandra, like I said. Sometimes there's subplots with Lennon and things like that feel forced and unresolved, that don't really pay off, that feel like they're just to add pad the story, and then you feel sort of like a half movie where there's a little bit here that hasn't been really well discovered and there's no payoff for it. And then there's Tsar, which we could have been spending that time with the Tsar and his history and sort of his fall from grace. I think the film definitely picks up as it goes along. It starts off pretty slow, but then it definitely ramps up, especially until the ending. The ending is one of the best endings of all time. I mean, it's really incredible ending that I really enjoyed. So I actually recommend this one, even though it's a little bit long. I think stay for the ending and stay for sort of the interesting character dynamics, especially if you like sort of a Lawrence of Arabia, sort of ego-driven, sort of powerful man that still has to reckon with sort of his past and history and legacy, which I think is very interesting. But why doesn't this movie hold up? I think it's really for history nerds that like this period of time, but also doesn't feel like a 70s movie. It's not something like The French Connection. It feels like a modern type of movie. And I think that's how the progression of a general film goer goes, at least, where at least this is how mine is. I think a lot of people are similar, where they'll see modern movies that they like and they'll watch modern movies, and then they'll take that risk and they'll go, okay, let me see some older movies that inspired some of my favorite filmmakers or are like them, just a little bit older. So watch French Connection, Clockwork Orange, for example. And then you go back and you say, okay, what inspired those? Scorsese loves Lawrence of Arabia and is inspired by that. Okay, let me check out some of the David Lean and some of these other epic movies. And then you have to go and see, okay, I really like this epic genre. Let me go see some of the failures or some of these other epic movies that maybe haven't done as well. And then you get to Nicholas and Alexandra. So I think if you go through that long journey like I sort of have, or if you're a history buff, you'll see this movie. So I think some people, it's not for everyone. It could be seen sort of as a stuffy period drama, especially at the time. It felt like a movie of the past, so I understand why it wasn't well respected even a few years afterwards. They were talking about some of the other movies that felt more looking towards the future, but looking back at it as a piece in this time period, I think that as a standalone movie, it is good. I think I did enjoy it. And there are some problems with it, some of the dialogue, like I said, some of the character choices, but I still do think that ultimately it was a good movie. I think I recommend it. So that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know what's your favorite movie from 1971. Was it McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Exorcist, or no, excuse me, French Connection? And then let me know what you want me to see me cover for next week for 1970, or even you can do the next week, 69 or 68, some of the upcoming ones. Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video and share it with your friends. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoy the video, and until next time, stay tuned.